It's a pleasure to be here in Guatemala, but it's with great heartbreak that I'm talking to you about the lessons for Guatemala from this war in Ukraine. When we discussed this talk with your colleagues here at the university about a week ago, I thought it would be important to talk about the implications of the war in Ukraine for Central America and for Latin America. But as I prepared this talk, I thought there was a more important lesson for all of you here, for all of us together at UFM, to talk about why the people of Ukraine have fomented such strong resistance against the Russian invasion. I think there are important lessons for all of us to understand why Ukraine is fighting the way that it is. And I think those lessons are deep at the heart of everything you do here at UFM. You understand better than anyone else why Ukrainians are succeeding in this battle. And they are succeeding. I have no doubt that Ukraine will prevail in this battle. As a professor, I tell my students that I'm not an activist. I never share my opinion from the podium. The best compliment I can get from my students, we don't know what she thinks. I love that. If you don't know what I think, I've done my job. It means I've created a platform for you to explore your ideas, to push me, to push each other. I'm going to take an exception for that today, because I do have feelings about what's happened in Ukraine. I first visited Ukraine in 1992, just a few months after the Soviet Union collapsed. I have seen the incredible transformation of that country from one that was very dependent upon the Soviet Union to one that has been flourishing. And I was last there a few years ago, visiting my friends at the Kiev School of Economics. So I'm going to begin our story today, in 2006, in something that was called the Orange Revolution. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Orange Revolution, but the Orange Revolution came about as a result of an election that went badly wrong in Ukraine. As we know, Ukraine has been battling for its independence from Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. In 2006, there was a revolution, this uprising against a government that many people perceived to be controlled by Russians. There was an election campaign that went horribly wrong. So you can see these pictures from the Orange Revolution where people were calling for greater independence from Russia. And one of the greatest moments that many people remember from that election was Viktor Yeshenka. He was the face of the Orange Revolution, and literally the face. He ran for president in 2006 against the Russian-backed Viktor Yanukovych. Yeshenka was poisoned right before the election. You can see his face, how his face changed in 3 months. 3 months. This is what poison does. Who has this poison? Where did the poison come from? It was clear that it came from Moscow. Viktor Yeshenka was the face of the Orange Revolution. The Ukrainian people prevailed over Russia during the Orange Revolution. But the revolution lasted about 4 years, and things went wrong. The reformers, Yeshenka, he was in power. He didn't deliver, like many revolutions. The hopes, the dreams were lost. The government didn't deliver as it had promised. People became disillusioned. They thought, we're young Ukraine. Can we really be independent from Moscow? Can we handle this? And of course, there are forces from the outside fomenting division, fomenting ethnic conflict, fomenting divisions between Ukrainians and Russians. Ukraine has a very significant ethnic Russian population. It has a significant Ukrainian population. And Russia did a wonderful job of creating divisions between groups. So Viktor Yanukovych, he was president. He was elected in free and fair elections. The people of Ukraine brought him back to power in 2010. There were elections in 2014, and there was deep disillusionment with the direction of Ukraine. A young, independent Ukraine decided, okay, we brought Yanukovych back to power, but we are looking towards Europe. We are not looking towards the past. And there were some lessons learned from inside civil society about the future of the country. And Yanukovych, just like every president, was increasingly unpopular. He couldn't deliver on his reforms. So what happened? Another revolution. Euromaidan. Euromaidan. Europe. This was the name of the revolution. Euromaidan. Maidan means square, public square. So the people of Ukraine, gathered together in Maidan, the Maidan Square in downtown Kiev, and they had the Euromaidan Revolution, which was a call to throw out leaders who were associated with Russia, who were fomenting hatred, fomenting discontent inside the country. And one of the unifying calls of the people in Euromaidan was to join the European Union, was to look ahead, was to look towards a bright future. And that's what they did. In 2014, they brought together a new government. Now, this moment is key, the Euromaidan moment in 2014. President Putin does not recognize this revolution. He says the 2014 revolution was illegitimate, and every government that came to power before this, after this, he would not recognize. So part of the invasion is to bring back the old political powers who were running Ukraine before this. But the popularity of Euromaidan swept the country, and something changed in Ukraine after 2014, and these are important lessons for Guatemala, important lessons for Central America, important lessons for my own country, the United States of America. What happened after Euromaidan? Ukraine understood that they had a precious moment. They understood this at the Orange Revolution, but things went badly wrong. There was corruption among leaders, there were corruption among elites. Things did not go well. They took this opportunity in 2014 to foment change. And what happened in Ukraine since 2014 is nothing short of a miracle, a miraculous transformation of society, not from the international donor community, not from the European Union, not from embassies, but from the people. What happened in Ukraine after 2014 was truly a bottom-up change that swept the country, that swept government, that swept ideas, and that swept how Ukrainians think about themselves. It changed the way Ukrainians think about their own identities, and it has been nothing short of a miracle. Ukraine changed, and people took things into their own hands after Euromaidan. So what went right? So a lot of scholars have looked at this, and what I want to point your direction to is civil society. What you began to see is the growth of a huge voluntary sector at the local level. People committed to changing their neighborhoods, to changing their apartment buildings, to holding their local level leaders accountable. One of the most important policy changes that took place was decentralization of local governance, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But these decentralization reforms gave people much more space to have a role and to have a voice in their own society. These civil society groups mobilized very quickly, and they became very active in the reform process. Very active. People proposing ideas, acting on it. People understand we had that Orange Revolution in 2006 and things went wrong. We can't let the same thing happen again because what happened? We were subject to leaders from Moscow. We lost control of our own political destiny. So people took this moment into their own hands and they began acting like nothing I've ever seen. And I've worked in many, many countries around the world, and I've worked with civil society organizations. I study them. I'm obsessed with them. What we saw in Ukraine was nothing short of a miracle. I've never seen anything like it. In a very short period of time, watching society take advantage of this window of reform and run, and run, and run, and run. Anti-corruption initiatives became very popular. Government officials had to then report their own assets. How many things did they own? What television stations did they own? All of the kinds of things politicians are never going to report. Ukrainians forced them to do this. And this was actually led by many academics. There were new political parties, new political movements that formed that were organic, that were not tied to the old generation of oligarchs. Now, those oligarchs are still around. Many people say that President Zelensky came to power because of his ties to some of these oligarchs. There's no denying that. But there was an entire political movement that was free of this. And the civil society that emerged was no longer talking to US government or the Germans. That was one of the mistakes that people pointed to, is that the civil society that came after 2016 wasn't organic. It was driven by donors. It was fake. It was artificial. It didn't have strong roots in society. But Ukrainians changed this after 2014. They understood we can't do that anymore. And looking to the outside world to solve our problems won't solve anything. We can blame Russia, we can blame everybody else, but until we make changes ourselves, nothing will change. They took the initiative and they ran. And they ran and they ran and they ran. And one of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh, his name is Timofey Milovanov. I'll talk about him in a second. He was actually my teacher in graduate school. We met the first year I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He's from Ukraine. I took an advanced undergraduate course in microeconomics that used a lot of calculus. I had been out of school for a long time. I had just come back from 5 years in Uzbekistan, so I spoke Russian. He speaks Russian. He was my TA. I was a first-year PhD student with a bunch of undergraduates. I was on the verge of failing my class. I said to my TA, Timofey Milovanov, please don't fail me. Please. He says, don't worry, you'll be fine. I didn't fail the class, but we've remained wonderful friends ever since. And Timofey, he, after 2014, went back to Ukraine and founded Vox Ukraine. I'd encourage all of you to look up Vox Ukraine. It's one of the most amazing think tanks in Ukraine. Based on data analytics, after 2014, he became so devoted to collecting data about his own country. He's trained as a game theorist. He's a mathematician. When I knew him in graduate school, he says, I'll never touch data in my life. I like to build mathematical models. After Maidan, he came knocking on my door saying, Jen, I have all of this data. I was shocked. So Vox Ukraine monitored all of the reforms that were taking place. They monitored their government. They collected public opinion data. They produced incredible analytical reports. Vox Ukraine, the voice of Ukraine, showed people what was possible. So this is Timofey. He founded Vox Ukraine. And today, he is in Kiev, and he's the president of the Kyiv School of Economics. It's a university that really reminds me of UFM. Kyiv School of Economics is about 30 years old. UFM is 50 years old. They were founded right after independence. This very small university devoted to economic reform, devoted to markets, devoted to understanding that Ukraine has to cultivate a better way. And that Ukraine and Kiev can be a center of learning, not a backwater, not a second-rate city, not a second-rate place, backseat to Moscow. No. Kiev School of Economics wanted to take the lead, and they have created a world-class university in Ukraine that has been an engine of reform. And education has transformed so much in Ukraine. And miraculously, Timofey, my TA, who I taught, we went to graduate school together, he ended up as a professor at the University of Pittsburgh where I work. So we've been together for 20 years as friends, as colleagues, and I support him in what he does. So we are building very strong connections. We have a partnership with the Kyiv School of Economics. And I've always told Timofey, no matter what he wants to do, we will support him. 2019, I was starting my center, the Center for Governance and Markets at the University of Pittsburgh. Timofey was to be our associate director. He calls me, he says, "I can't do it, Jen." I said, "Why?" He said, "President Zelensky's called me, and I'm going to be the Minister of Economics, Trade, and Agriculture." So he served for about 8 months as the Minister of Economy of Ukraine. The government collapsed. It's a parliamentary system. The prime minister was fired, and all the ministers left. But Timofey today is an advisor to President Zelensky on economic issues. And so we work very, very closely with him. And I have seen the changes of Ukraine through his eyes. He was someone who was so uninterested in his country. He loved his country, but felt like he could do nothing to change it. But after Euromaidan, he felt so empowered, founding a think tank, becoming president of a powerful university, and he has done so much innovative work. It's so inspiring to watch. And I hope that one day, all of you can visit Ukraine, visit the Kyiv School of Economics, and I hope that strong partnerships can be built between Guatemala and UFM and KSE. You're like brothers, you just don't know it yet. So one of the big changes that happened in Ukraine after 2014 was decentralization. As Ukraine looked to Europe, Europe said, "Okay, you want to join the European Union? Well, you got to make some changes." All of the countries in the post-Soviet space inherited highly centralized forms of government. That disconnected people from the government. People felt they had no control over their communities. So there was a massive, massive reform that took place after 2014. New local government units were created. One of them was called a Hormada, the main local government unit, and this is actually a picture of one of them, where local communities could actually decide for themselves what the size of their local government would look like. It was called self-amalgamation. Communities themselves decided which neighborhoods would be part of their local government units. It was all from the bottom up. And this self-governance generated so much of the civil society that we see today. This decentralization made people feel that they were owners of their own fate. And so you can see here, this is a map of these Hormadas across Ukraine. And some communities have joined Hormadas and some have not. It's up to them whether they form a local government unit. It's amazing that when you give people choices, people control their fates and they work together. And this is the remarkable thing that we saw in Ukraine. This began in 2014, completely new. People use their initiative and their creativity to create new futures at the local level. Now, I know you're thinking, why is this relevant to me in Guatemala? What does this have to do with geopolitics? What does this have to do with the war in Ukraine? It has everything to do with the war in Ukraine. If we want to understand why the people of Ukraine have been so effective in fighting Russia, we have to understand Euromaidan, we have to understand local governance reforms, we have to understand civil society. So Ukraine, for the first time, had this opportunity to really elect local leaders, to be responsible for local budgets, to take their fates into their own hands. So Ukrainians were electing cadres of very young mayors. You can see some of them here. This was before the war. Very creative people who wanted to transform their societies, but who had roots in their societies. Not officials from the center who looked down at the people in the communities as second best, worthless, stupid, uneducated, peasants, These people led their communities. And these people, this civil society, this desire for change from the bottom up is exactly why Ukraine is succeeding in its fight against Russia. Why has Ukraine been so united? When Russia invaded Ukraine, we can see the Russian military was not prepared for this action. Russia amassed 200,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. President Putin gave an impassioned speech saying the people of Ukraine really are not their own people. They're not really a separate nation. There are many ethnic Russians all over Ukraine. But what happened after 2014 was quite amazing. My colleagues at the Kiev School of Economics did a wonderful public opinion surveys. Sociologists, you'll meet one of them in a second. They found that identity changed. People's views of themselves changed. Rather than seeing themselves as Russian, rather than seeing themselves as Ukrainian, Tatar, whatever ethnic group you may come from, people began to identify with their community. They began to identify with their city, their town. Why? This identity transcended ethnicity. People became so proud of what they had accomplished in their cities. They became proud of their mayors. This is the mayor of Mariupol. Maybe you've heard of Mariupol. It's the city in southern Ukraine that has been completely destroyed by Russians. I have a dear friend who lives in Mariupol. I haven't heard from her since the fighting began. I knew her in Uzbekistan. She was a very famous women's leader. And she was herself ethnically Russian. She grew up in Uzbekistan, which was part of the Soviet Union. She spoke Uzbek. She loved her community, but her husband wanted to retire to Ukraine, where he was from. They lived in Mariupol peacefully for the past 10 years. No one's heard from her for the past 2 weeks. The entire city has been destroyed, flattened. But the mayors quickly became the face of this change in Ukraine.
Вони перейшли до нової стадії терору, коли намагаються фізично ліквідувати представників законної влади, законної місцевої української влади для окупантів. Україна вимагає негайно звільнити мера Мелітополя і гарантувати повну безпеку усім головам громад усієї нашої держави. Якщо ви перетворюєтесь на аналог терористів ІДІЛ, то який сенс тоді з вами про щось взагалі розмовляти?
So a few days after this video was recorded, that mayor was released. President Zelensky gave him an honor. The mayor of that town, he's an ethnic Russian. But he became the mayor of his city. It didn't matter to the Russians about ethnicity. You see, identity in Ukraine began to transcend ethnic groups. And a real Ukrainian identity across ethnic groups began to emerge. And that's why we're seeing...
Добрый день, мы из Украины. Ну что, ребята, теперь у меня есть свой личный трофейный тигр. Добрый вечер, мы из Украины. Отжатый мужественно нашими пацанами, с работающей электроникой. Теперь я смогу еще больше повеселиться. Готовьтесь, оккупанты, вашей же техникой бы вас лупить. Добрый вечер, мы из Украины. Только что попалось, что пресс-секретарь Орков счел оскорбительным то, что российскую армию сравнивают с орками, и призвал больше так не делать. Ну, что я могу вам сказать? Одесситы подсказывают, что никогда страна, у которой на гербе курица, не победит страну, у которой на гербе вилка. Добрий ранок, ми з України. Погода прекрасная. Планы прекрасные. Где тут солнце? Кыш. О. Так что доброе утро всем. Начинаем работать.
This mayor, he's an ethnic Korean. There was a Korean population that existed inside of the Soviet Union near the Korean border, and Stalin in the 1930s and 40s deported them to Central Asia, and then many of them ended up in Ukraine. He's speaking Russian. He's a mayor of a Russian-speaking town. This has nothing to do with ethnic identity, but you can see what changed in Ukraine is deep, deep support for local leaders. Ukraine wouldn't be winning this war with support of President Zelensky alone. I know for many of us, we watch TV, we see this charismatic President Zelensky in his t-shirts and his muscles. But people aren't going to fight for a president in a distant capital. People are going to fight for their leaders in their towns. And why? We're seeing video after video after video of communities that have been captured by the Russians. And I know you've seen these videos of the brave Ukrainians who have come together protesting against Russians, the Russian troops, not against ethnic Russians, but the Russian government. And many of the biggest protests have happened in ethnic Russian cities in eastern Ukraine. They are confronting the Russian soldiers. And this is not what Russia expected. Russia expected the ethnically Russian parts of the country in the east to fall quickly. They said that Putin said that the ethnic Russians would be throwing flowers on their tanks, thanking them for liberation. But just the opposite has happened. Why? Because people in these communities valued freedom. They valued the ability to create and build for themselves. So speaking of building for themselves, I just want to end this talk today by introducing you to the Kiev School of Economics. They just bought this building last year. It's a brand new building. They used to be occupied 2 floors of a business center in downtown Kiev. They raised money. They opened an undergraduate program for the first time. They had their own building. They had just renovated it. It's phenomenal. But they only operated in this space for about 6 months before the war began. And since this happened, the faculty, the students and staff at Kiev School of Economics, a place so similar to UFM, they've been fighting the war. They've been collecting data. They've been analyzing things. They've been going to class. They've raised more than $11 million in humanitarian aid. And a lot of that, it's body armor. I've asked them, what do you need? Body armor. People are dying of shrapnel wounds. There's no body armor in the country. That's what they need more than anything else. So that's what they're working on. So I've raised funds for the Kiev School of Economics. That's Timofey and I. A few years ago, I ran a fundraiser for them in Kiev, helping them build this building that they now own. And I do hope that you understand very well the power of change that you have, the power that you have to inspire. You are learning so much here. I have been so inspired by the students I have gotten to meet over this past week. And we're learning about local governance. It's my passion. So of course, I'm going to tell you a story about how local government explains everything. But you've learned about Tocqueville, you know Hayek, you know the Ostroms, you know the power that can be inspired by change at the local level. What they've done in Kiev has fomented, has driven change from the local level. So I'm going to leave us with this is a message from Timothy Brick. He's a dear friend, and he's just been appointed the wartime Vice President of International Relations at the Kiev School of Economics, and he has a message for all of you today.
Buenos dias. Hello friends at Universidad Francisco Moraquin. My name is Timothy Brick. I'm assistant professor at Kyiv School of Economics, and I'm acting wartime vice president of international affairs here. I'm calling you from my bathroom, which is my shelter. And I'm using only one headphone here because I want to be alarmed and I want to hear whether there is an airstrike or not. This has become a new reality for many of us Ukrainians who work in academia. The war has caused a lot of deaths for civilians and military, but also our campuses are bombed and our students and our faculty is fighting in territorial defense or work as volunteers to provide humanitarian aid, medicine, food, and just emotional support to other people in Ukraine, in local communities. I know that your university is very much alike to our university. I know that you're celebrating your 50th anniversary. And we are going to celebrate our 30th anniversary very soon. And I hope that we can build some friendship and collaboration to rebuild Ukraine and to restore academia and to have many, cultural exchange, joint projects, or travels to see each other and to learn from each other. I know that Guatemala has also gone through many, many years of wars, and this is of course terrible, and we should not live in the world full of suffering and wars. We want to rebuild Ukraine, but we also want to rebuild the world to make it a better place, to solve humanitarian crisis, and to ensure that there will be no more conflicts. And for that, I invite you to future dialogue with us, to have more collaborations, and I hope we can see each other in future, maybe in Guatemala or maybe in peaceful Ukraine, to sit together and to talk about life. So thank you very much for your support and for your solidarity, and I wish you a great day and a great conference. Enjoy. Hasta la próxima.
The future is yours. It is yours. And you can see the lesson for Guatemala from the people of Ukraine is that it's in your communities, it's in your towns, it's in your cities, it's in your education, and your desire to promote change from the bottom up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Our first question is, do you think Ukraine will ever be able to join NATO, or is the price of peace in Europe accepting Russia's influence in Europe, in Ukraine?
It's a difficult question. President Zelensky has recently said that he doesn't think that NATO membership is really possible right now. And, I think that this issue of NATO, which seemed to motivate Russia, we focus on this a lot as like the trigger for the war. I'm not necessarily convinced that NATO was really the reason. I think it was a reason for Putin that he used and he exploited, and he made a lot of Western policymakers, reflect on NATO. But I'm not sure this is the real reason that Putin went into Russia. It gave him a rationale, but Ukraine was never, ever close to becoming a member of NATO. And that was well known. So I don't think it's possible right now. And even President Zelensky has said himself, he's almost renounced this idea in recent days. So I think if we're going to listen to him, the answer to that question would be yes. I think that it's no longer something that's feasible. I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves strategically is what is the role of NATO in the future? Mm-hmm. And if you are Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Romania, members of NATO countries, there's no better rationale to be a member of NATO than looking at these bomb cities in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So where Putin says, look, this NATO expansion is not a wise idea. If you're a country living on the border with Russia, being a member of NATO right now looks like an incredible defense. So I think it's a very complicated question.
I think we're all surprised that the Russian army's advance has not been as successful as they originally envisioned. We're surprised that this conflict has extended to the amount of time that it has so far, and we're excited to see that the Ukrainians have been able to even push back in certain areas. Do you see this as perhaps the beginning of a collapse of Putin's regime?
I think so. I mean, it's, as social scientists, what do we say? We explain, we don't predict. But it's clear that there are very deep divisions within the Putin government right now. And as we saw, from my presentation, the reasons for Ukrainian, the resoluteness of the Ukrainians, many people were surprised at the resistance against the Russians. I think the Russians have been the most surprised by this. And it shows how little Russia understood Ukraine. It shows how little the military forces and the security forces understood what was going on there, is that they had one narrative. And it was a narrative they kept promoting for years. It was that the Russian-speaking population was a victim to Ukrainian nationalism. And that was the narrative that Russia has used. And Russia has used that narrative with other countries as well. So I spend most of my time working on the Central Asian republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, all of the stands. Putin has said the same thing about Kazakhstan. He said it's a fake country. There's a huge ethnic Russian minority in the north. And he says the exact same things about Ukraine that he does about Kazakhstan. It's the role of these governments to protect the ethnic Kazakhs. The ethnic Russians. And just as the same situation in Ukraine. But I think what it shows is that Putin got so much wrong. He didn't understand Ukraine, and now they're saying that the Minister of Defense hasn't been seen in 12 days, the Russian Minister of Defense. Key factions are beginning to defect from the government, key political players, longtime supporters of Putin. So we might expect some kind of cascade, but I think it's going to be very, very hard in Russia because the authoritarian regime is so deeply entrenched, so deeply entrenched.
From the comments you've made, you made reference to how Putin has been commenting on other countries. Do you see that if Putin were to be able to do something in Ukraine, that he would extend his approach to try to put together the old empire that he's trying to form?
Absolutely. And I think that is the biggest victim. After the people of Ukraine, obviously. But one of the biggest victims of this war is Putin Expansionism. That, I think, is now over. Because Russia has been so badly defeated. They haven't lost the war. I don't want to be premature. We don't know how long this is going to last. But there was just an estimate I read today that 40,000 Russians are killed or missing. 40,000. You think that the United States lost 2,200 troops in Afghanistan over 20 years. 40,000 troops in 1 month. Now, we don't know whether these figures are real or it's hard to know, but the losses for Russia have been devastating. And Russia is actually relying quite heavily on its Muslim ethnic minorities to fight this war. I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last when they see the caskets coming home. But I think this idea that Russian expansionism, the restoration of the Soviet Union is the future, is a mistake. I think that idea has now become quickly buried, at least for now. Some of these ideas take a long time to die, and they can resurrect themselves after a generation. But so many of us focus on this issue of NATO expansion, and I want to be very clear about something. I work in Central Asia. I remember in the late 90s when I was working in Uzbekistan. This was before the talk of NATO expansion really, people were talking about it, but it wasn't as prominent as it was the past 15 years. And government officials in that country would come up to me and they would say, Jen, you Americans, you're worried about the Taliban, you're worried about Islamic extremism, you're worried about terrorism. This was actually right before 9/11. But don't you see, if you look around the former Soviet Union, there's instability everywhere. But it comes from one place, Russia. This is what worries us. And the president of Uzbekistan, who's heard of Uzbekistan, right? He gets on TV and he gives a speech and he says, there are people in Russia who are trying to restore Great Russia. He said this in 1995. This was before NATO expansion. So yes, NATO expansion may have figured into Putin's rationale, but I think there are certain sentiments inside the Russian government that wanted to restore this empire, regardless of what NATO did. And these ideas have long been there.
When we first saw the invasion, I think seeing the news, everybody was asking themselves, could this be something that we can see elsewhere? Specifically, China has been hinting at Taiwan. There's a lot of interest in gaining Taiwan back. Do you see this as a possibility?
Well, I think after this, I think we can say anything's possible. I didn't think Russia was going to invade Ukraine, quite frankly. Even with the troop buildup that we saw, I didn't think that Russia would do this. In fact, my friend Timofey Milovanov didn't think Russia would do it. I saw him a week before the invasion in Pittsburgh. None of us thought Russia was actually going to do this. There were some people who did. I didn't. The US security establishment said that this would happen. But many of us thought this was for other reasons. So I'm not convinced that, I think the stakes are much higher for China in Taiwan. The US has a very significant military presence, alliances in that region. I think China understands what's at stake in a way that Russia didn't. My sense is that China has a better understanding of the consequences it would face if it did this to Taiwan. And that the military, I mean, there's the huge, US naval presence, the escalation that would result in would be much more catastrophic than what we're seeing in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, I'm not convinced that China is going to take the same action inside of Taiwan right now. But we've been surprised, haven't we? Yeah.
Most definitely. We're actually getting to see the effect of sanctions on economies. And we can almost say that it can be almost more devastating than actual armed conflict. We see that China is taking a relatively neutral approach to this. We see India continuing to establish relationships with Russia. Do you see, with these continuing sanctions, the possibility of another axis coming out of this?
I think that is a possibility, but I'd be curious to know the views from here, from Guatemala. Guatemala hasn't signed on to any sanctions against Russia. Mexico has not signed on to the sanctions against Russia. Many countries in the world have not. So we see the United States and Europe and Japan, sort of solidified in the sanctions. But I don't think, when you're a poor country, you don't have as many choices. So this is economic expediency and efficiency, and I think I hope the United States understands that, is that countries don't have as many choices. India has a very long legacy, very long history of relations with Russia, gets most of its weapons from Russia. But now we're seeing really incredible alliances across South Asia. Russia is very now aligned with Pakistan, which is very new, and India is aligned, and they're both aligned with Russia. It's very interesting to watch, but I don't think that we're going to see this strong alliance. And in fact, one of the things that concerns me is how enduring the relationships among the European countries is. Mm-hmm. to continue fighting this, because European countries are now facing increased fuel prices. You can see even Germany wavering a little bit. And so how long will Europe be united in these sanctions? So I think that's even the bigger question, whether or not we'll see an axis between Europe, the sanctioning countries versus the non-sanctioning countries. We're even seeing American companies take advantage of loopholes and still remain active inside of Russia.
Well, we have to realize that sanctions don't just go in one direction. There's an effect both ways there. We have a question about Euromaidan. What were the main actions done by the central government post-Euromaidan that produced a good decentralization?
So I think part of it was this desire to join the European Union. And so when you want to join the European Union, you have to submit yourself to a series of reforms. And so because the country seemed united in that and moving towards Europe and away from Russia, that promoted many of the reforms that we saw. But it was intrinsic, it wasn't extrinsic, right? It was from within, that people wanted to do this. It wasn't that the Europeans were saying, you must do this, you must do that. Because it wasn't like the European Union was saying, Ukraine, join us tomorrow, right? The European Union is like, ask us 3 times and then we refuse you, right? So even right now, President Zelensky has asked for expedited membership to the European Union. He did this about 2 weeks ago. And the EU has yet to respond to that. But the reforms included the decentralization, a lot of economic reforms. Timofey Milovanov, when he was Minister of Economy, did important land reforms that focused on privatization of land. And a lot of the anti-corruption work, dealing with the declaration of assets, procurement reform, understanding, increasing transparency in government, I think did a lot. And they were very effective in doing that. So I think those are some of the key reforms that we saw that led, after Euromaidan, that gave the government much more legitimacy than it had in the past. And it's that legitimacy that's getting people to fight for the state. And you see, I think that Putin was banking on people's perception of the government as being completely illegitimate or corrupt or weak or unpopular. And it's really, and actually President Zelensky's popularity was quite low before all of this happened, because the country was, I think in many ways Putin succeeded. He didn't have to invade Ukraine to destroy it. The threat of invasion scared off investors, scared off the economy, just destroyed the economy. And the economy had actually been doing quite well in Ukraine since Euromaidan. Incredible growth rates, incredible agricultural production. And when Putin amassed these troops, what I thought he was doing was just destroying the country from within. Because when you do that, what investor is going to come? If you think this country is always under the threat of war, and that's where my colleagues in Ukraine were very upset, and they kept saying, don't believe he's going to invade, don't believe he's going to invade, because if you believe he's going to invade, you are allowing him to win. Because you're not going to invest. You're not going to send your students on an exchange program to Ukraine, right? If you think that it's going to be at war the next minute. So it was that strategic calculation that Putin actually didn't need to do this to destroy the country. So now he's destroyed, I think he's destroying his own military through this action.
Well, it's interesting because we saw, there's actually comments that we're seeing 20th century strategies in a 21st century war. And we can imagine more and more frustrated Putin probably thinking about escalating this. We see it in the shelling of the different cities, the army staying back and shelling the cities. Do you see this to escalate to a certain degree where we can actually see nuclear weapons being used?
I'm afraid to answer that question, just because it's too horrific to think about. And I'm just going to remain optimistic that Putin is not irrational. I don't think he is. And let's not hope. I hope that doesn't happen. Will he become desperate enough to do it? I don't know. But I hope not. So it's even too horrific to think about, isn't it?
Do you see this escalating into more than just sanctions and for other countries to actually just not just send equipment, but actually start sending troops and having this escalate into something beyond what we're experiencing right now?
I think that the hope is no. I don't think that, who would get involved in this, right? Would it be Europe? I don't see Europe sending troops to Ukraine right now. And I think that the only real option that many people are entertaining is the idea of American troops. If there's discussion of American troops in Ukraine, I don't think that's a possibility. There's no domestic appetite in the United States right now for anything like that. The Americans are exhausted from these forever wars of the past 20 years. After Afghanistan, and I think Afghanistan is actually one thing that made this possible, that Putin was understood that the United States was not really involved. Foreign policy across the past several administrations has been very insular, inward-looking, and so even the unity on sanctions issues really surprised me, actually. I didn't think that Europe would come together as quickly as it did on these issues. And in fact, I thought what Putin was doing strategically was driving a wedge through NATO, was driving a wedge through even the EU, because we had begun to see fissures. We saw Brexit. We saw questions about NATO. What is NATO for? And now with Russia's action, we've actually seen these groups come together. Now, I'm not sure how long this will last, because as you pointed out, sanctions go two ways, right? So, of course, Russia's economy is being destroyed by this, but many other economies are being destroyed by this. European economies are being hurt very badly. Fuel prices in America, I imagine here, you're feeling the same pains. In Central Asia, where I work, 30% of the GDP of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are dependent on remittances from Russia. Their economies are being destroyed by all of this. But what surprised me is every one of those countries, none of them have supported Russia. None of them. In fact, they have actually come out speaking against Russia in ways I never imagined they would. I was really surprised, because they are so dependent on Russia. You would think that they would just be quiet. But they have actually spoken out and called for an immediate ceasefire, a cessation of all violence. So this has surprised me that I don't see, so the answer to your question is I see these alliances actually becoming stronger. It'll be interesting to see if these economies can become more resilient, and if markets can respond to the economic pressures, if we can find alternative sources of fuels and things like this. But how quickly that will happen, I'm not sure. But it's been really surprising to see the way that these countries have come together, despite the hardships that they're encountering as a result of sanctions. But I don't see troops from other countries. I mean, I think the big question that all of us have to be asking is, how long is this going to go on? And that really is a question that's in Putin's hands, isn't it? But it doesn't, I think we're all hoping for a quick end to this. But it's hard to say. It's really hard to say what he's calculating. But if he doesn't have soldiers, who's going to fight this war? But is he going to rely on other sources to do this?
We're seeing the repercussions beyond just the fuel issue. We're seeing repercussions in terms of fertilizers, and that is going to have a long-term impact in terms of the productivity that a lot of other countries have in terms of food production. Our next question is, the Soviet Union lasted from 1917 to 1991. Isolated and building an atomic arsenal, and a poor population was the price. How long do you think the association between Russia and China lasts? There has to be a point where China decides this is maybe not the best idea. What's your take on that?
It's certainly a marriage of convenience right now, and it's a relationship where China has the upper hand. Russia is very isolated. So Russia doesn't have much of a choice. It has to look to China. China is not isolated. So I think the question is how much longer is China going to tolerate Russia? I think China has to decide. I think China could put enormous pressure on Putin to stop. If anybody could, it's going to be China. China has been much more reserved on this than I thought they would be. I think they understand the stakes of this as well. I don't see this relationship lasting for very long, to be honest. It's a marriage of convenience now. These are two countries that have had long rivalries, very long rivalries, violent rivalries. Russia needs China. China doesn't necessarily need Russia except its fuel. China has fertilizer. The fertilizer issues are really interesting. And Ukraine also is a source of fertilizer. Losing that wheat production and so many things from Ukraine. So I don't see this as lasting very long.
Okay. I have a very specific question here. What do you think about the possibilities that Russia is going to attack Georgia or Moldova after it finishes the war in Ukraine?
So Russia has already attacked Georgia. And I was in Tbilisi about 6 weeks ago. And if there was a place where people thought that Russia was going to take action in Ukraine, it was among the Georgians. They really thought this was going to happen, the people I was talking to, because it happened there. I think Russia now, though, is so distracted. Its military forces has been so devastated by this that does it have the capacity to do this? Moldova, well, they had this small force in Transnistria, but remarkably, the president of Moldova, a newly elected, pro-European president, they've very much like Ukraine, they've gone back and forth with pro-Russian presidents, pro-European presidents. A woman, she's a recently elected woman president of Moldova, she said it's time for the Russians to take their troops out of Transnistria. That was kind of remarkable that she had the courage to say that. So I think we're beginning to see what we've seen in Ukraine is this resistance. Georgia, I think, is another very interesting case. I think that there would be a real groundswell again if Russia intervened more in Georgia than it already has. And there's just a question of the sustainability of these troops. The CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, that is Russia's military bloc. If you recall, in January, there was an uprising in Kazakhstan, and maybe some of you are paying attention to what goes on in Kazakhstan, but there was a big uprising, an internal strife within the government, and the Kazakh president called upon the CSTO to intervene. And so that president of Kazakhstan called upon Russian troops to come to Kazakhstan, intervene in an internal affair, and depose a certain faction within the government. When that happened, I looked at this and I said, Kazakhstan has just thrown away its sovereignty. The president, in order to stay in power and defeat internal rivals, has asked Russian troops to come in. The Russian troops left after 10 days. So what I was really wrong about, I thought I was certain when Russia came into Ukraine, the first people who would come out and support Russia's actions was Kazakhstan. To my surprise, the first people who said they will not recognize Russia's actions was Kazakhstan. That really surprised me, and I think it shows us how weak Russia is. Russia has 7,000 troops on the Afghan border in Tajikistan as part of the CSTO. The CSTO is like the new Russian answer to NATO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. They put a lot of pressure on all of the former Soviet states to join it. Only 5 have. There's supposed to be 7,000 troops on the border with Tajikistan protecting that country and the former Soviet countries from Afghanistan. What's happened to those troops? I think we're seeing a real weakening of Russia. I think there's going to be big implications for that across the region. So I don't think these countries are now scared. And it's quite amazing because these are the places where I thought they would definitely sit back and support Russia, but they've actually been the most vocal. So I'm not confident that Russia has the fortitude to continue doing this.
I think this conflict has been quite unique in the sense that we see an incredible amount of information coming in from social media. We see an incredible amount of propaganda. You have to question, what is it that we're seeing? Is this real that we're seeing from the Russian perspective? And we see the Russians manipulating a lot of their people, telling them certain things to kind of get them behind all this movement. Could you elaborate a little bit on the propaganda side and how this is playing out?
Yeah, it's been quite striking, and to see, I speak Russian, I understand what comes out of the Russian media, and I think the big question for me is, how much do people really believe what they're hearing? It goes back to this issue. I don't know if your students have read, there's a famous economist at Duke, his name is Timur Kuran, and he wrote a book called Private Truths, Public Lies. And what he does in this book, it's a 1989 book, where he explains the fall of the Berlin Wall. And he talks about cascades. And he says, how is it that in 1 minute it seems that everybody believes this fantasy, but then in a minute it just collapses? And I think in Russia we're seeing, a lot of people believe the propaganda of the government, but I'm really wondering how deep that is. In Central Asia, where I spend a lot of time, people love Putin. These Muslim populations in Central Asia love Putin. Why? It's always been surprising, because they get Russian media and they see him as this strong guy. He's tough, he's strong, he protects traditional values. Shirtless. Horses. He's like tough, and it's a really remarkable shift, because a lot of these post-Soviet countries, for so many years, saw Russia as the threat, like the thing that destroyed their culture. And a lot of these countries now, except for Ukraine, began to see Putin as the defender of tradition. And that was an interesting shift to watch. But I think what's damaging that is the fact that Putin is getting hammered. And so Mr. Shirtless, horse riding, fishing, whatever he does, judo, he's looking really weak right now. And if you compare, this is where I think, on the other side, the social media, Zelensky is a communications whiz. The way that he has used social media so effectively, and his t-shirts and his muscles, right? He's won the hearts of so many people around the world who had no idea who he was. This guy was an actor. And he's been very effective in communicating. And if you compare, one of the pictures, the memes that we keep seeing on social media is Putin at this long table, and then you see Zelensky in the tents with the troops, right? So the contrasts there are so real. I think the question is, how much are people seeing this in Russia? How much are they exposed to this? But I think as those body bags come back to Moscow, those are real nails to the heart of the message that Putin is sending.
In the news today, it came out that Ukrainians are starting to use facial recognition technology to be able to identify Russian soldiers, fallen Russian soldiers. I guess to be able to transmit or put a face behind these victims. So we'll see something come out of that for sure.
Oh, you mean the people who've been killed?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes, over here, please.
How do you think the aftershock of this war will affect the entrepreneurial process in the world?
I think it will probably make the world more entrepreneurial. Anytime there are hurdles, like war, you see people do amazingly creative things. And I think that is sort of one of the untold stories from Ukraine. And something that I hope to convey is not just the civil society, but as business, is the way that people in Ukraine, for example, have taken things into their own hands. Businesses doing remarkable things. All of these, they're the ones donating and filling up supply chains. So I think war also creates opportunities for entrepreneurs, both licit and illicit in so many different ways. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
How can Russian civilians who want to help Ukrainians, how can they help
Russian civilians?
Russian civilians?
I think doing the hard thing, and that is standing up to the government, right? I think some of the very brave protests that we've seen in Russia. You remember that woman, I think it was a famous picture on social media, she held the sign up behind the TV. I think we all saw this, right? Yes. Those kinds of acts are one at a time. Those are what really hurts the Russian government. You know, I've spent so much time in Russia. I love the people of Russia. And I know that most people in Russia don't support this. They don't support war. There's such strong history of bonds between the people of Russia and Ukraine. This is politics. And, but you know, Russia has prospered under Putin and has regained its strength. And I think people are very wary to lose that. It's scary.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Jen.
Hi, Alice.
I'm doing this question on behalf of my faculty classmates. What does a realistic peace look like for you in Ukraine?
That's like dreaming, isn't it? Peace. I think it all depends on what happens in Russia. I mean, it depends. We have seen strong resistance in Ukraine. And I think that Russia, I hope it now understands that it cannot dominate Ukraine. It cannot rule Ukraine. It cannot govern Ukraine. Even in the cities like Kherson is the one city that the Russians have conquered. Every day there's protests. And there are ethnic Russians who are protesting the Russian government soldiers. So this is not along ethnic lines. I think Russia does not have the coercive capacity to govern Ukraine. You know, maybe what we'll see is Russian control. Maybe they'll gain some territory in Ukraine. But even I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical that Russia has the capacity. So maybe the first part of this is, you know, renouncing NATO. But I think that we're going to see this Ukrainian government survive. And I hope that's just not wishful thinking on my part. But I think that we'll see this government endure and resolve among its allies become even stronger.
Excellent. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much, Jennifer.